Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to you all. My name is Cheryl Fishbein, and I am honored to serve as president of the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. Since 1976, the JCRC has served as the primary community relations arm of the New York Jewish community, building relationships with our neighbors in civil society and our public officials in order to create a more interconnected city for all. As we know, today we were supposed to gather virtually at this time for the broadcast of the Celebrate Israel Parade. This parade is produced annually by the JCRC. However, out of respect for the current situation, after the grievous killing of George Floyd and the subsequent protests around our city and nation, JCRC decided for the first time in the parade's 50-plus year history to postpone it. The virtual Celebrate Israel Parade will be broadcast 2 weeks from now on Sunday, June 21st at 1 p.m. We believe that this moment in our nation's history is not the appropriate time for celebration. As we noted in a public statement early last week, the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York is appalled and angered by the death of George Floyd at the hands of officers in the Minneapolis Police Department. Our sorrow is further compounded by the recent killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, additional acts of ugly and violent racism. We in the Jewish community know all too painfully the end result of unchecked hatred. Instead of celebrating today, we have created this space of healing and listening for us to come together and learn about racism specifically directed toward the African American community in our city and across our nation. Thank you all for joining. I would now like to call upon Rabbi Michael Miller, Executive Vice President and CEO of the JCRC of New York, who will frame today's gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Today's gathering is indeed very special. We have an opportunity before us to listen and learn from trusted leaders and friends in New York's African American community. We are joined by political leaders, community leaders, and faith leaders to provide a broad understanding of how racism in New York and in America manifests itself. While some of us may be very aware of the issues our guests will address, others may not be, and we invite everyone to listen, learn, and begin to heal together. I want to be clear that this gathering is not constructed as a dialogue. This is not a moment for us to talk and ask questions, but to actively listen to the words of the leaders who have joined us today. With that, I would like to officially welcome our friends and speakers. Sam Pierre, Chief of Staff to New York City Council Member Farrah Lewis, Tamara Fish, co-founder of Kasbar and former president of the Jewish Multiracial Network, Jennifer Jones Austin, CEO and Executive Director of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, Reverend Dr. Charles Galbraith, Senior Pastor of Brooklyn's Clarendon Road Church, the Honorable Greg Meeks, Member of Congress, and the Honorable Leticia James, Attorney General of the State of New York. It is our honor to be joined by all of you. Thank you for being here and for sharing your voices. I would also like to welcome my colleague and co-facilitator, Rabbi Bob Kaplan, Director of the Center for Community Leadership at JCRC-NY. Bob is instrumental in developing and nurturing so many of the relationships that we build at JCRC. And a warm welcome to my colleague, Eric Goldstein, CEO of UJA Federation of New York. UJA and JCRC share a very distinctive relationship as we work together to tackle many challenges facing the New York Jewish community. We thank Eric and UJA for their generous and continued support of JCRC. And now we'll begin the program. In advance of this gathering, we asked our speakers to answer the following 3 questions within their remarks. 1, throughout your life, what has been your personal experience with racism in America? 2, Why has the murder of George Floyd caused such unprecedented response? 3, what does this moment in time mean for you, and what should it mean for us? Our first speaker is Sam Pierre. Sam is an alumnus of the inaugural cohort of JCRC's We Are All Brooklyn Fellowship. He is the founder of the Haitian American Caucus and presently serves as Chief of Staff to New York City Council member Farrah Lewis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sam Pierre.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Miller. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm very excited to be a part of this very important and much needed conversation around social justice and economic justice for African Americans in this country. Thank you to the JCRC, which I humbly and will always be proud to say that the JCRC helped me become who I am today in my public service career, and helped shape the framework and my thinking on how to organize our people. And of course the UJA for being the visionary and showing us how to really move things forward. So to jump right in and to answer some of the questions, what has been my personal experience with racism? I believe growing up, my parents put me and my sisters in private school rather, until the 8th grade. So I was in a very sheltered private school, very small. So and growing up in the church, in a Black church, it was very difficult to see racism and at face value. When I went to high school, at the time, I went to South Shore High School in Brooklyn, New York, which at the time was one of the worst high schools in New York City. And we had to go through metal detector scanners every single morning. And if, like if you were going through the airport, and, dealing with that alone, right? That culture shock was very different, but also we were over policed, because when we got out of the school, if you were out at a specific time, people were asking you, where are you? The truancy police, things like that. And I recall being a freshman and not feeling well and wanting to walk home and getting pulled over by the cops. What are you doing? And me saying, hey, well, I don't feel well. I threw up in school and I'm just walking home. And that ended up resulting me into the precinct, right? Where I ended up throwing up in the precinct. But because, what is he doing? It's 12 noon, it's 1 o'clock, why is he walking? Where is he going? And they picked me up. And, those were, I would say those were my first encounters with, not being, someone not believing me or not understanding, that, hey, I might have a cause for the reason why I'm not in school. I had a note, right, from my guidance counselor that said he was leaving school, but none of that mattered at that time. So it's experiences like that can cause, people from the African American community to start to feel like, their positions or their thoughts don't matter, right? Because it didn't matter that I had a note that said that I can leave, I can go home. The fact of the matter is that there was an African American male who's not outside of the box that was created for him. And what tends to happen is that as you start to get older, the conversation shifts from, hey, I have rights. I'm a person. I can, I can defend myself, to if you're getting pulled over, if you get stopped by the cops, you have to be able to say this, or you have to be able to say that. People won't believe you. You need to have extra help. You need to have extra proof, right? Your word is not enough. You need to have additional support. And I think those are the kind of things that end up shaping the attitudes around African American community when it comes to policing and racism in America. I was able to turn my experiences with the police into a positive, because I remember my senior year, one of my friends got thrown to the ground, and I tried to stand up for him, and I told the police officer, what are you doing? And the police officer told me, if this is the law, and if you have a problem with it, you need to change it, right? And I was able to take that, and I would love to find that police officer wherever he may be, because I want to thank that police officer, because that was the driving force that challenged me to go and go to a precinct council meeting, which led me to intern at my local state senator's office, which led me to get involved in government and politics. And that's the kind of thing that drove me to want to be a public servant, to want to get involved, because that police officer told me if I didn't like the law, then I should change it. And I instantly took his word and I jumped right in. And I believe that is the reason why this George Floyd situation, rest in peace, has caused there to be such an outcry from the Black community, because I believe now in 2020, we finally understand that we do have the power, right? And we are a peaceful people, but we are not powerless. So we can leverage the power that we have to make real change happen. And that is one of the reasons why I joined Councilmember Lewis's office, because I knew that I couldn't just sit back and watch everything happening, that I had to get involved, and I had to talk about the legislation, and I had to be in the room, and I had to be a part of that conversation so that we can affect change. Things like 50A, which is going to be historic this week, I believe, in the state. Councilmember Lewis has a chokehold bill right now that Councilmember Rory had back in 2018 that we're reviving, right? That talks about the fact that you cannot just choke anyone, in New York City. Being a part of that conversation is the passion that drives me. And I definitely, want to thank the different elected officials and leaders, Attorney General Leticia James and Congressman Meeks, for being the folks in the front, right, who paved the way for people like myself and Councilmember Lewis and other Assembly Member Rodney Bichot, right? Because now we can see the work that they're doing, and we can emulate it on a lower level, on a citywide scale, or on a state level. So those are the things that I believe. Those are the reasons why I think Black America is finally, we're standing up, because we understand our power now. We understand how to leverage the media. We understand how to articulate and communicate our needs and our asks. And I think that is the reason why this George Floyd's incident has become a national incident, because our community is finally at a place where we can let the world know that we mean business and we have our asks and we want them to be paid attention to. And finally, what does this moment in time mean for me, Saint Pierre? I believe that this is a unprecedented time. For the first time ever, you have large corporations that are coming out publicly and apologizing for the situations that are occurring for African Americans in this country. And I think, African Americans have always asked for reparations. We've always asked for 40 acres and a mule. We've always asked for equality, and we always ask for justice. But I personally think that all of that is rooted in respect. And I think once someone respects me, then I don't need justice from that person. Because if you can respect me as a person and you can respect me as a human being, then I don't need justice, because I have your respect. And that respect can manifest in economic justice, right? If you respect me, then you'll respect me as an equal, and you'll pay me accordingly, and you'll give me the economic opportunities that I need so that I can take care of myself and my family, right? You can respect me politically. You can respect my voice, right? You can respect me as a man, right? And I believe, for me personally, that all of this is giving me an opportunity to be able to speak up for my community, to stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before me, that put very important pieces of legislation on the table so that we can continue to push things forward. And I'm really excited about that. To conclude, I just want to say that Councilmember Lewis is she is on the forefront of this issue. She is the co-chair of the Women's Caucus. So she, yesterday for the Breonna Taylor repass, she was there. She's also a vice president of the Black Leaders Caucus in the City Council. So we are pushing forward. We're excited. The mayor had a briefing this morning, and all of the things that we mentioned in our letter to him, the mayor was able to include in his briefing. So I believe that we're moving in the right direction. There's so much more work that needs to be done, but it's conversations like these with the leadership and our partners like the JCRC and the UJA is what's going to help take us to the next level. And I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. I am here as a supporter, a friend, anything that I can do. Rabbi Miller, Rabbi Kaplan, I'm President Fishbein. I appreciate everything you're doing, and I just want to let you know that we are here to help. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sam, for your meaningful remarks. Leticia James is the first African-American and first woman to serve as New York State Attorney General. She is a former city council member from Brooklyn and served as public advocate for the city of New York. I was privileged to accompany her on a JCRC mission to Israel several years ago. Tish has always used her pulpit to speak out against racism, hate, and prejudice of any form. Please welcome Attorney General Leticia James.
Thank you, Rabbi Miller. Thank you for that kind and warm introduction. I truly appreciate it. Our country and our state, they're reeling, and people are in pain. We've reached a tipping point of anger and frustration. The images that you are seeing and the voices that you are hearing in New York City, in Minneapolis, in DC, in Europe, all speak to the issue that this country, unfortunately, has not lived up to its values. And so what you are seeing now is individuals who are shining a light on the hypocrisy, and that it's really critically important that individuals whose voices have not been heard, that their voices be heard now. We've been grappling with the issue of race since the inception of this country. It's unfortunate that it's embedded in all of our institutions. And so I want to thank you for having this important discussion, because the first part of addressing and dealing with the problem is recognizing that we've got a problem, and then coming up with some comprehensive solutions and suggestions and doing it together. And my heart is warmed when I attend some of these protests and I see Black and white. In fact, I see more white than Black and Asian and Latino, but it's primarily young people who want to see a different world. Young people who recognize that we should not be separated by race, which is an artificial construct. Young people who recognize that individuals should not be treated different simply because of the color of their skin. Young people who recognize that in our Constitution, it says equal justice under the law. And we've got to live up to those realities and those values, and we've got to demand it. And I do know that so many individuals have unfortunately been focused on those who might want to hijack the message. But Dr. King said that riots really are the language of the unheard. But I also want to recognize that there are also some individuals who unfortunately are taking advantage of the situation. Individuals who are opportunistic, but also those who really want to be heard. But the last 2 days, in fact, have been very peaceful protest. Individuals who are just in pain. And they really reflect the anguish over the killing of Mr. Floyd, who we are laying to rest today, and Ahmaud Arbery. And of course, Breonna Taylor, whose birthday was celebrated 2 days ago, was about to turn 27. And the names go on and on and on. So I want to thank Congress, and I want to thank Albany, and I want to thank the City Council, and I want to thank all of these governments that are passing legislation. I want to thank them. But it's really about changing the hearts and minds of people. That's what this is really all about. And understanding how racism affects all of us. And it's up to all of us to raise our voices and to recognize that we are all part of one family and one humanity and have to be respected as such. I was impacted the most, I guess, when we were in the midst of the stop and frisk crisis. And I've told this story over and over again. When my nephew, who was in college, came to visit his favorite aunt, me. And he traveled here from out of state. And he was stopped and he was frisked simply because of the color of his skin. And when he arrived at my house, he was shaken. And to see a 19-year-old young man who wanted to conquer the world, who wanted to grow up to be someone on Wall Street, to see him crawl up in a ball in the corner of my house and crying in his fetal position because he felt he was humiliated. And all that I heard him cry was, "Auntie, I did nothing wrong. Auntie, I did nothing wrong. Why did they do that to me?" It was at that point when I knew that I had to raise my voice even louder and that I had to join with others. And to see all of these young boys and girls marching and speaking out with pain, and all of them wanting to grow up and not to be shot and killed, and to have families and to be married and to live the American dream, and all of those who live in fear. I know that we as a society can do better. And I know that the Jewish community understands and feels our pain because they too know hate. And that's why it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. And so my message is clear. Let those kids march. Let them march until the walls of intractable racism come falling down, crashing down to the ground. Let them march so that they can see the love and they can recognize that they see no difference. Let them march because we know that we've got to change a system which unfortunately is embedded with racism. Let them march because change must come. Let them march so that their voices are heard. Let them march so that no more young people have to crawl up in a corner in a fetal position and cry out with pain. Let them march because we as a country, we as a people, we as part of one human family, we must and can do better. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Attorney General, for those incredibly powerful remarks. As always, you educate us, you touch our hearts, and may your remarks inspire us and our country to action.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I'm Eric Goldstein, the CEO of UJ Federation, and so glad for this large crowd to be joining us in this important conversation today. The New York Jewish community wants to be part of the change that's so desperately needed in our country to address racial injustice and inequality. And we recognize that the first step to being partners is just to listen and learn. In that spirit, it's my honor to introduce the next speaker, who I've been listening to and learning so much from in the 6 years I've been at UJA. My friend, my colleague, Jennifer Jones Austin, the CEO of FPWA, the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. FPA, FPWA, and UJA, along with Catholic Charities, help support together 80% of the social service sector of New York. And we meet regularly to talk about how we can do things better to improve the social service sector. And now we, FPWA and Catholic Charities, are talking about how we can work together to help advance racial justice and equality. Jennifer is among the leading voices in our city today and is a trusted advisor to so many. She brings intellect, passion, and enormous compassion to everything she does. And I'm so grateful, Jennifer, for your joining us this afternoon. Jennifer Jones-Austin.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon to all of you. I first just want to express my appreciation for being a part of this gathering, this conversation, this much needed space for listening and for healing. I have come to know well both Eric and Rabbi Miller, and what I can say in this moment that is that this really is an intentional gathering, and that is deeply seated in an earnest desire to be part of conversation, to learn and to listen one from another and one to another. And so I'm so thankful for this moment, truly honored, truly humbled to be a part of it. And in it, I'm reminded of the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest. And you're evidencing that in this moment, that you understand, you appreciate, and you embrace that. So thank you. I have a daughter who's 22 years old. And when she was just 3 years old, we were on a subway traveling from Brooklyn into Manhattan. She was learning her colors. And I remember that we were on one of those subway trains that has the yellow and the orange seats that are kind of like buckets, not separated from one another, but you'll see a yellow and orange and another yellow, or you'll see two oranges, sometimes there'll be a pink. And so we were looking at the seats, and I was asking her, what color is that seat? What color is that seat? What color is that seat? And she was answering. Then she turned and she looked at me and she said, Mommy, you're yellow. And I looked back at her and I said, no, I'm black. And she looked at me and she said, no, Mommy, you're yellow, as if I was confused. And I looked at her as if she was confused, and I responded, no, sweetheart, Mommy is black. And I said to her, what color are your shoes? She looked down and she had on some black shoes, and she looked up at me and she said, they're black. I said, yes, Mommy's black, just like your shoes. She just looked at me with the most what's wrong with her face, most confused. And she said, no, Mommy, you're yellow. I was doing that because my daddy had actually said to me, she turned just 3, when are you going to start teaching her about the appearance of Black America? My dad, she's too young, Daddy. Why would I burden her with that? And his response being, no, you have to start talking with her so she understands our experience. And you need to let her know that no matter whether she appears to others to be yellow, light complexioned, something other than black, she is black, and she will be regarded as black in this nation and in this society. And so I began finding ways to talk with her, not in ways that would alarm her or concern her, but help her to appreciate the history, the present, and our hopes for the future. My daddy was a civil rights leader. He founded the Progressive National Baptist Convention with Martin Luther King Jr. He was the president of the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was the national president of the Operation Breadbasket, which was the economic justice arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So I'm going to be honest with you and tell you, I don't remember a time when race and racism in America wasn't a part of our family's conversations. We talked about it at the dinner table. We talked about it when we went out the door. We were proud Black Americans, and it was our responsibility, it is our responsibility to represent our race as best we can, to be there in the good and the bad times. So I've always known race and racism. Being in an intellectually gifted class, if you will, as an elementary school student, and remembering that my teachers and even my classmates, being the only one Black child, they would look at me as though I was different. Maturing in my adult years and at a young age, being a senior leader in government, in the private sector, and even in the nonprofit world, and having experiences like, taking the executive elevator up to my office and getting on with white persons who were quick to tell me not my colleagues, but quick to tell me I was on the wrong elevator, or being challenged for being analytical or thoughtful. Wow, I didn't really know that you were so intellectual, Jennifer, or you had that analytical capacity. And always appreciating, yes, it might have been about being a woman, but they weren't saying it to my woman colleagues, the female colleagues. They were just saying it to me. So racism, racist attitudes have always been front and center in my life. What is happening right now gives me hope. It gives me inspiration. I think about why it's different. And yes, I see young people rising up and saying no more. And I see all of us out in the streets. And as Attorney General James said, often more persons who are not of color who are out there. And I think to myself, why is this different? Well, I think it's in part because COVID has kept us all, behind closed doors. And we've watched the news and we've seen how persons of color, immigrant communities and impoverished communities have been more greatly and disproportionately impacted, everything from infection rates to death rates. And now we're seeing the loss of unemployment being greatest in communities of color and persons with low income. When we hear that Black Americans represent, more than 50% of Black Americans are now unemployed, we can't ignore those facts, especially because a lot of people have lost jobs in ways and in places and spaces that affect us. So I think COVID has brought some of this home and laid bare some of the injustices. But the other thing that I believe has happened is that when you look at a video and you see that for almost 9 minutes, that one man kept his knee on a Black man's neck, heard him say, "I can't breathe," and then 3 other officers just stood there and did nothing. We at our core are human beings. We're taught to hate, but at our core, we love. We can't ignore that. And so that prima facie evidence makes us lean in and say, no, not anymore. We can't stand for this. And that's why we're out in the streets in large numbers here in this city, across this nation, and across this world. Because we saw depraved indifference for human life, and we determined, no, not anymore. This moment gives me hope. It gives me inspiration. But I'm going to tell you, in this moment, I also am filled with angst. Because what I see playing out is that we're all leaning in, and we're saying no more to police brutality, to racial injustice in the form of policing, that it is not acceptable for Black men and Black women to die at the hands of police officers when they have at best been alleged to have committed a crime. We're saying no more to people, thinking that they are going to take law and order into their own hands and go brutality, and people going rogue and trying to hold up the law on their own, if you will. That we may miss the moment and not appreciate that police misconduct, police brutality is just one system with institutional and structural policies and practices that keep Black people down. That this is the moment when we have to pivot, and we have to understand that this problem is much greater than police misconduct and police experiencing. When we look at job loss, when we look at healthcare disparity, when we look at educational disparities, housing disparities, environmental disparities that plague Black and brown communities, that what it all is just centuries of structural and institutional pervasive policies and practices that serve to keep Black Americans down. And so we've got to take this moment and say, I'm with you on police misconduct, but I also need to be with you, Black Americans, as we talk about systemic policies and practices that keep you from getting ahead when it comes to jobs and wages, economics at its core, education and housing. So my hope in this moment is that we're going to take it and we're going to go with it. We're not going to just stop at, let's see police reforms, but we're going to say, I'm with you, and let's engage in all of the necessary reforms to bring about equity and equality. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for being with us.
Jennifer, thanks so much for your important remarks. May you continue to teach us and to lead us into the future. We're honored to have with us today Congressman Gregory Meeks, representing New York's 5th District for 11 terms since 1998. Prior to his election to Congress, Congressman Meeks served for 5 years in the New York State Assembly. He's a true public servant. His 5th congressional district, including Southeast Queens and parts of Nassau County, is very diverse, and the congressman has worked tirelessly for decades in bringing these diverse communities together and strengthening the district. Congressman Meeks serves as the senior member of the House Committee for Financial Services and chairman of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, which oversees all matters pertaining to the stability of the banking system. Congressman Meeks is also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and works to bring economic opportunities and address underlying disparities, including by making quality health care accessible to all. The last time Congressman Meeks and I stood together in person was on a the banner, "No Hate, No Fear," to combat anti-Semitism. 25,000 New Yorkers of all backgrounds and faiths came together that day to say no to hate. And again now, New Yorkers of all faiths and backgrounds must come together to raise our voices against hate, bigotry, and racism. And so please join me in welcoming Congressman Meeks to today's gathering. We welcome your important voice to this conversation.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for all of the work that you continue to do at UJA. And thank you, Michael Miller, my friend, my brother, for your continued work. And of course, with Bob Kaplan, thank you for your continued work. Let me just start. I was going to start somewhere else, but Eric mentioned something that I think that's important. Yes, I really marched across that bridge, and I wanted to because I understand hate and racism and anti-Semitism, and it hurts all of us. And I want to make sure that my voice is always risen when that happens. I'm old enough, as you can see, barbershops are closed, so I've got this beard and everything is growing right now. But that shows that gray. To tell you that racism has lived with me all of the 66 years that I've been on this earth, from the time that I can remember. My parents are from South Carolina, and I can recall being a small boy, I guess, age 5 to 6. This other stuff stays with you and stays in 10. I never will forget. Shows you how it wasn't that long ago. On this train, when we pulled right out, got up to Washington, D.C., all of a sudden we had to change from where we were sitting on the train to another portion of the train that was not comfortable. Food was no longer accessible to us. So we had to bring, my mother had, of course, a brown paper bag with food and sandwiches and things so that we could eat for the rest of the journey. I recall pulling the station in Chester, South. And the first thing when you get off the train, there were signs. There was water fountains. One said white, the other said colored. There were bathrooms. One said white, the other said colored. You could look at the water fountains and you can see one was clean and had been kept and the other had not. You can walk past the bathrooms, and this is a young boy, stays in my mind. One was clean. One might not have been clean for a month. You could smell it. I can recall going to my grandfather's house where my mother was raised, and how he was called a boy. He was my grandfather by every white person that would pass him. Hey, never Mr. this or Mr. that. Hey boy, how you doing? Put down. My father, he was a big man. In fact, he was a heavyweight boxer. But no matter who passed him that was white, they put him down. And I could see and feel the hurt in my father at that time. Never will forget it. Didn't really understand it at that age. But it hit and it has stayed in your mind. Never has left till this day. Well, I guess I'm bringing it up now. I have watched and continued when I went to school. I lived in public housing in elementary school. Now, I remember that someone came to my mother and said, we're going to take him out of this school. Community school. School was right across the street from my house. So they took me out of this school and sent me down to PS 183, which was on 66th Street in York Avenue, where virtually there was only 3 or 4 Black children there.
Okay.
I wondered why they were taking me away.
Oh, I have to go off. Okay, I'll call you back.
And even at that time, fixing up our school that I went to at across the street, it's PS 121 at the time. It wasn't the same caliber. I found that out when I went to the other school. They had more things there. I was going from the 3rd grade to the 4th grade, but it was immediately as upon a young person that the opportunity to schools there was completely different. What was available at PS 183 on 66 York and what was available at 121 was completely different. The exposure and the things that we did at 183 and my friends who lived in public housing who never made it there, still went to 121, was nowhere near of what 183 had. Immediately you could see the differences and the disparity in the education. Racism all my life in junior high school. Now I show my daughters a book I still have it. In fact, I could show it to you sitting here on my desk. But my whole life, I wanted to be an attorney. And I can remember in my junior high school, I went to see a counselor or teacher. They said, but what do you want to do when you grow up? I said, I want to be an attorney. He said, oh, why you want to be an attorney? I said, that's what I want to do. He said, well, you should lower your goals. You should think about doing something else. It's good to be a sanitation worker or something. There's nothing wrong with it, but I wanted to be an attorney. They didn't say that to any of the white students that were in the school. I asked all of them, and I had better grades than many of them. But they were lowering my expectations, telling me and trying to make me feel that I could not accomplish. Now, I probably was more fortunate than most because I had a mother who wouldn't take that. Because when I went back home and told her what took place, you better believe the next day, she was at that school and she wanted that counselor in front of her. And she wanted me to be there so I could hear what she had to say to that counselor. Don't you ever tell my son that he can't accomplish his goals. He can do whatever he wants. And the person was stammering and hemming and hawing. saying I was just trying to tell them what was best. Some other parents or some other person, student like me, whose parent that had gotten there, many may have felt, because what I think that they were trying to do is to make me feel inferior to someone else. And you got to remember, when you think about race, that's the whole idea of how you created and kept someone a slave and tried to make them less than someone else, less than a human being, which was the original intent in the United States Constitution. I went on to college, and I can go through other incidents with my parents, etc., but I'm trying to cut it short. But I've lived with this all my life. I went to Adelphi University. I got off the Long Island Railroad train because I was going to live on campus. I had my bags in my hand to go on campus, to go to my dorm room. No longer than a half a block down, lights and sirens comes and pulls up next to me. I had to show them and tell them, what are you doing here? Because I'm in Garden City, New York. What are you doing here? I said, I'm about to go to school. At that time, Adelphi didn't have many Black students. So I had to find my student card. They wouldn't let me move or do anything until I could show them a student card that I was going to, and I was just walking down the sidewalk. I'll jump up to even my predecessor, Floyd Flake. I remember after he got elected to Congress, we were walking down the street in another part of his district then, Howard Beach. And they said, who are you? He walked into a shop and he said, I'm your congressman. I said, no, that can't be. What do you mean it can't be? He said, I'm your congressman. He said, we can't have a Black congressman. And he had to literally show his congressional ID to show that he was a congressman. And all through, whether you talk about Eric Gardner or Amadou Diallo or a number of others, I've gone to jail a number of times to fight racism. And oftentimes it's been on deaf ears. 22 years in the Congress today. Just about every year of those 22 years, the Congressional Black Caucus has come up with a budget that they've submitted during the appropriations period of time. And that budget was intended to look at the disparities that were taking place in this country at every level. We've hardly had any other votes, people voting for that budget or taking it seriously. Just recently, not that long ago, we got over 100 votes and we celebrated. But if you analyze those 100 votes, it was because we had over 50 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, joined by members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and joined by members of the Asian Caucus. Very few of anybody else, and never getting any real consideration to eradicate the injustices and the disparities that are now becoming patently clear to everyone else that have existed in this country for a long, long time. Many come up and thought that after Barack Obama was elected, we were living in a post-racial America. All of us who Black knew that that wasn't the case. We hoped that Obama would be able to make a dent. But you saw what happened to him. When a noted Black scholar had his house, was stopped going into his own house, Professor Gates, and Obama said anything or tried to bring them together, people went after him. Don't want to change the basic essence of what this country has been. So I'll, could go and give you story after story. But I will tell you this. After seeing Mr. George Floyd and what's taking place, I was devastated inside, as I am anytime that I hear about the killings of a Black man or Black woman. I know how, because I'm a former prosecutor, how police officers lie. And they're taking for granted what they say. I know how they cover one another's back. Police unions try to make sure no matter what happens, that officer is never wrong. Even Black police officers get intimidated because if they say anything, they feel they can't get promotion, they can't move up, or nothing will happen. Something will happen negatively to them. That's racism in America. But my joy and hope comes from those young people that I've seen on the streets. Again, I'm old enough to remember as a kid, the civil rights movement in the 60s. And those were young people. And sometimes people forget that when my colleague John Lewis spoke, he was only 23 years old at the March on Washington. And he got involved at the age of 17. And it wasn't just something that was a short period of time, because it took a long time, for years, to fight to pass legislation, to get civil rights and voting rights. In the past, it seemed to be shortchanged, and Dr. King said at that time, we're not going to remember the bad deeds of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. But as I've gone out to these rallies recently, and I've seen those crowds of young people primarily, of every background. They were Black, they were white, they were Asian, they were Hispanic, of every religion. And I was proud to walk in the Rockaways not too long ago, arm in arm, with many of my Orthodox brothers and sisters who called me and said, I want to come to the demonstration when they heard about it, because I know wrong when I see it. And I want to stand up and make sure my voice is heard. And I see others who decades ago may have been silent, have decided that now we're not going to be silent. So the hope that I feel and the joy that I've seen young people come together in the 60s and they made a difference and they changed the direction of America. And now we're at this point where these young people are coming together again with the opportunity to really change the direction of America once more. And to focus on the issues that we've been talking about and crying about as we keep mounting and getting additional people of color elected to office, like Leticia James, who's our Attorney General, like Keith Ellison, who's the Attorney General in Minnesota, who's now looking and focused and immediately took hold of that case, in my estimation. It makes a difference when people come together, because it causes others who may not listen if it was just African Americans. But when you have others that are joining you and you're hearing voices from all around, it makes individuals really have to search deep in themselves and in their conscience and think about what's really taking on and say, I know, you know what? My conscience won't allow me to allow the status quo to remain. So I hope and I pray that we're at this point right now so that we can change protests, will transform as it did to legislation in the 60s to legislation. But as Tish James said, hopefully it will really penetrate people's souls and change who many of the good folks who've been silent on the sideline to stand up and say, I can't be silent anymore. And I'm going to stop and fight with them till freedom and justice and disparities are over in the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman Meeks. Greg, thank you so much for speaking from the heart and from your personal story that caused that greatness in the beard, that caused the wisdom that you imparted to us, and it was just profound. It's my distinct honor to introduce Tamara Fish. Tamara is the founder of Kazbar and the former president of the Jewish Multiracial Network. She's a former president of Congregation Tehillah in Riverdale, where I live. But most important, today, Tamara has dedicated herself to assisting clergy and lay leadership to actively include Jews of color in the greater Jewish community. And it is again my honor to introduce Tamara Fish.
Rabbi Bob Kaplan, the honor is mine. Thank you for inviting me, for including me in this distinguished panel. It's wonderful to see you here, wonderful to meet you again. Eric Goldstein, it's a pleasure. I wish it were for different reasons. As I got the handout of things to consider, things that we would be prompted to speak about, starting with our stories, I had to switch gears a bit because actually I'm trained as an educator. I was a college professor for 10 years and I loved it. Except I didn't like writing articles and that type of stuff. I like talking with people, that's what I do. And I started to think, yes, I could tell my story. I've told my story before. I've got great stories. You ask any Black or brown person in America, they got a story. My question to you is, the broader audience, how many stories do you really need to hear? Really? I mean, after a while, I began to wonder, what are these stories for? Yes, they may very well inspire, but I know that they also become cocktail fodder, things that you tell people, oh, I heard this great story about, oh, it's so sad. And empathy and sympathy are great, but what's called for now is action. Because we've been here before, right? Anyone who's within 70 years in this country has been here before, either through the civil rights movement or people who have been in the civil rights movement or people who are, how many times do we have to hear that the New York City public schools are the most segregated schools for a metropolitan area? How many? And so I started to think about stories. And I started to think about how we get to stories. And generally the idea was people in the vast population don't know individual stories, that the individual stories help us connect and help us feel. And there is truth in that. But I think they also have a flip, sort of a subtle and insipid quality about stories, is that it lets the listener off the hook. As a listener, we feel obligated to listen carefully. Well, you know what? That's kind of easy. That's very easy. And ease is not what the situation calls for. So I will not tell you about my experiences of racism. Let me tell you something. You know how they say to assume makes an ass of you and me? It's really not true in this case. You look at any black or brown person, you can assume they got a story. So let's ride with that assumption and let's come and address actually why George Floyd at this moment is so poignant, what it unleashed. We as Americans generally are not very good at connecting the dots on things, especially history, okay? And so the nexus is where Black and brown people live. We have stories of police brutality, that's fine. It's not fine, actually. No, what I'm saying is, when you take that and you drop it in COVID, and again, we hear about how Black and brown communities are affected. Go deeper. What does it mean that our society seems okay with letting Black and brown people make a daily choice between starvation on the one hand and making an income at the risk of your literal life on the other? What does it mean then that in the midst of this COVID, where we again sympathize, but somehow feel perhaps powerless, right? We have a story of a video that goes viral of a white woman using strategically her location in society, her credibility versus Black men to intimidate, make a false report, and try to injure this Black man at the risk of his own life when she was walking the dog. What does it mean that at the same time, a woman who's sleeping in her own bed, an EMT, you know, the same people that we call on to respond to COVID, gets shot in her own bed because police are breaking down the door? Her partner has a gun. No, wait a minute. This is very interesting. You can stay your ground as a white person and shoot people, but you can't stay your ground as a Black person and shoot people when they're coming in your door with guns. What does it mean that a misdemeanor can end up with a boot on your neck? So we say, why is it George Floyd? I'm asking, why the hell didn't this happen earlier? How much has to happen? How much has to happen? And if people are thinking about the anger, let's just think about us as New Yorkers. Us New Yorkers have seen people flip out in public for, you know, things such as, I don't know, being 5 minutes late and getting a parking ticket and arguing with the cop. A Black person generally would not do that because we're afraid that we'd get arrested. We've seen it. We've seen people at stores freaking out. And somehow people feel it's a God-given right. Now, imagine this is happening to your life where you can't sleep in your own bed or you have to choose between life and death. Why not sooner? And the reason why I bring up these questions, these points that you already know and framing it differently is because we need to think differently. And when I mean we, I do mean we. As an African-American Jew, okay, I go into predominantly white shuls and I can hear the concern, the genuine concern. The people reaching out saying, what can I do? Impotent, powerless. The first thing you can do is to own stories, own history, as Black history and white history. And what's important? Because we're talking about systems, not individual stories, systems that have existed. Let me give you an example of an easy system, right? Show of hands. I can't see you, but participate. I love response. Show of hands. How many people know the benefits that Social Securities have given their grandparents? Raise your hand. I'm seeing people up. Raise your hand. Raise your hand, please. Thank you. Okay, now, how many of you are aware that Social Security, when it passed, only because the Southern Bloc made it strategically impossible for 95% of Black people to qualify? Yeah. Agricultural workers and domestic workers, which constituted 95% of the Black population, very large percent of the North of Blacks, were deemed that they could not participate because they really wouldn't disclose their salaries or what they were being paid. And therefore there was no way to track how much they could contribute, supposedly. Think of where your families would have been if you'd been denied, your families had been denied Social Security for a generation or two. GI Bill, structural inequities. People say GI Bill allowed soldiers returning to purchase homes and go to college. We know how much education lifts people economically. We forget as Americans, because we don't talk about history in the whole, that schooling and education largely disenfranchised, kept out Black and brown people. There were quotas. What you often don't hear is that those same GIs returning were tracked into largely vocational jobs by the people helping to administer the GI Bill. And if they had not already been in college, there were not enough slots or opportunities available for Black and brown people. How many people would be in a different economic position if their parents or grandparents had not attended college? Don't let me start talking about unions. Structural inequities here, our American history here. When we as Jews and fellow Americans embrace our history, we will see that this is in clear defiance of what we uphold as Jews, that there should not be two laws. One for the rich, one for the poor. There should not be two laws, one for the ger, one for the people in the community. And our tradition calls for us to make a response. And inaction is a response, but it's the wrong one. The great rabbis say, you are not charged with completing the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. The world that we create of justice cannot simply be for us alone if we live in a sea of injustice, because it affects us, it infects us. And there isn't really an us and them in this world anyway. We can see it in New York. How many people have health home care for the elderly, or nannies or whatnot that are people of color? How many people shop in a grocery store where the people behind the counter are people of color, or people stocking the room are people of color? What happens in their lives do affect our quality of lives. We are in this together, and the failure of American society from day one in this culture is that we refuse to be one people. There's a tug, because in Judaism, we are often reminded that we are a people, right? And we cannot rest in being a people, separate, and choosing to participate in a larger society when we decide to. No. We know from history, we know from World War II, that just doesn't work. We are in this together. And so what can we do? Hey, we are well connected on every level. I'm not calling, yes, call your senator, state representative, call everybody. Call the person that you know who perhaps owns a grocery store or organizes labor or has a business that employs me. Put pressure. What are you doing to ensure that the treatment here is equal? What are you doing? Is it public? Yes, we can all perhaps take a bit of a cut if need be. Listen, people need to pay living wages. We can do this if we choose. The question is, what do we choose? The question is, what are you choosing? Because we've seen this before for 50 years. And it's not just, I applaud the young people out there, absolutely. But it's not just their shoulders that our country has to rest on. We have to assume responsibility. We have to make changes. We have to make calls. We have to live our Jewish ethos. And if we don't, what the hell is the point? And after that, I have nothing left to say, but thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Powerful words and a powerful call for us to take action and live up to the tenets and values of our faith. And God willing, we will move there and we will be there. I'd like to now call upon the final voice of this gathering, the Reverend Dr. Charles Braid. Now, Charles is the senior pastor of the Clarendon Road Church in Brooklyn. I met him over 10 years ago when he spoke at a forum. I was told by one of our early speakers, Pierre, that he was somebody we needed to listen to. This is 10 years ago, and we need to listen to him now. Charles is the powerful voice of faith that has dedicated his life to enduring and ensuring the words of Scripture, justice, justice shall you pursue. He's also the recent recipient of the 2020 JCRC Martin Luther King Award, and it's with great pleasure and extreme honor that we welcome Pastor Charles. Take us home.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaplan, and greetings to everyone who's connecting with us. I've just been so encouraged and strengthened just to hear the voices of others and to be inspired by them. Brothers and sisters, as I reflected on what to communicate, what to speak in the midst of this moment, I was jarred when I watched the funeral yesterday, one of the funerals of George Floyd. Watched it because it was taking place in a town called Rayford, North Carolina. Rayford, North Carolina is about 12 miles away from where my ancestors, who were mislabeled as slaves, were brought towards this country. It's the same soil, the same sand, the same smells, the same place where this man was prepared to be laid to rest that my family came to unrest. It is that same area and same community where my grandfather home was burnt down by the Ku Klux Klan just because he dared to try to buy the property that he served as a sharecropper on. I come from a family where my father and mother currently live in a home in the metropolitan DC area of Washington, DC, where they had to sue the real estate agency just to allow them to be able to view the home where they currently live. I've lived in society and had the distinct privilege of having my mother serve as an educator, go to a private school in the DC area where I was the only African-American in my entire class and the only of only 4 in the entire school. To see and to experience daily doulage of racism, of chants, of expectations, of pain. I don't have the time, as others have shared, to tell all the stories. One story I will lift up that I think speaks to, even as our Congressman Meeks lifted up, was when I was there with my guidance counselor concerning college. And after the challenge that had been there, and I was instructed and told that maybe I should think about other colleges and maybe I shouldn't go to certain schools or what was going to take place. There was a list on the board that had all the schools that people had gotten into. And the guidance counselor, or the one school that I did put up on the sign, she erased. I told my mother this, the next day my mother made me march into the school, and to my embarrassment, but I now understand it now, she made me list off every single school that I was accepted in in the midst of that moment, to say that I am here, that I am present. I serve as a pastor within a community that has been afflicted and affected with the challenges that others have shared concerning racism in regards to structural issues that have afflicted and affected us, whether that be to comorbidities in regards to our health due to inequities concerning healthcare, whether it be to the challenges concerning the disproportionate dynamics concerning food access, whether it be the challenges we've experienced concerning opportunities to going into higher jobs that's present. Unfortunately, I've also had the experience as a pastor within this community, one who serves and one who seeks to bring peace and justice, of just 1 block away from my church being pulled over with guns drawn where my entire family is in the car, just to question, what am I doing and where am I going at this time of night? This is a reality. This is a challenge that is present. Why I'm hopeful yet in the midst of this, because I always look towards joy and justice and hope. I make the joke in our congregation. You have to excuse the colloquialism that I'm a hope dealer. That I deal in hope. I deal in the possibility of what can be. We are currently in a moment where we have seen and visualized the pain that is present. People have asked me over these last calls and over these moments, why this image? Why this moment? And I lift up my dear sister, Tamar Fish's question of why not earlier. Moment is significant because, as others have said, it's the symbol and I think the crystallization of a knee on the neck, where we have felt and experienced, seen something collectively that I think also gives imagery towards what particularly people of color and Black people have physically suffered throughout this nation since 1619, to feel the pressure and the pain of a knee on the neck. I think because of that and how it was visualized and experienced, people have been galvanized towards action. And I have to let you know, as a self-proclaimed hope dealer, I really do have hope. I have seen and been a part of 3 marches already, and I will be going to one later on today, where I've seen a sea of diversity, a sea of people from young and old of various colors coming together and crying out for justice. The saying that we want to create a reality of a country that sees justice roll down and righteousness like a mighty stream. That we have folks who are gathering together to not just gather, but also to demand and declare things that are unordered are brought right. And as my brothers and sisters know in this moment, to call for the full shalom of God, the fullness of it in the midst of this moment. I'm one of those who is particularly encouraged and find solace and strength from the tradition of the prophets. And one thing I appreciate, one theologian lifted this up, that the prophets had a dual reality. The prophets criticized what was broken. And I believe in this moment, we are called to criticize what is broken. We know it's broken. It doesn't take much research. You can look at the inadequacies concerning health, economics, education, a host of housing, all of these that are present. We have to call it out. We have to name it. We need other voices to join with us to calling it out. In another text, it's found in Psalms, the 31st chapter, it declares, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And so we need voices to join in and criticize. But the prophets just didn't criticize. They also energized. They criticized, but they also energized. By energized, that means while they tore down the structures that were present, they reimagined a reality that can and could be. And so I believe that in this moment, I really am excited. I'm excited because I feel as though collectively we are seeing what is broken, and we're seeing it on a universal scale. Now is the work, after we have criticized and after we have called out, to reimagine and to build, for us to construct in the imaginations of ourselves what can be. And as we know in the prophetic tradition, we don't speak what we see, we speak what God said. And so my hope and my desire is for us to be able to speak those things that are not as though they would be. Where we see brokenness, we find the place for there to be a healing balm. Where we see there's divisions, we find the hope of shalom and unity together. Where there are tensions and inadequacies, we find the righteousness and the justice of the people who are called together for meaningful transformation and change. I don't think it's by coincidence we're going through COVID. I don't think it's by coincidence we're going through this. This is a moment. This is a time. This is the opportunity. We've looked back toward the past, and I've talked about my parents and their generation towards their marches that they did in the 60s and the work that they've done concerning justice, and my grandparents who had ancestors who had to suffer in silence. This is another moment, but guess what? We're no longer silent. We are not just lifting our voices, but your voice can be included. And our desire is your voice is added and your hands are present in the midst of this as we tear down and dismantle the walls of racism structurally and build up who we are called to be, unified as one people. My prayer, my hope for us is that we would walk in this with an imagination, energized with the possibility of hope, peace, shalom. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Pastor Charles, and deep thanks for your voice and your call, but most of all for your hope. And it's a hope that I, and I'm sure everyone on this gathering, shares. I also want to give deep thanks and to all those who've opened their hearts and have guided us today, and Pierre and Tamara Fish and Jennifer Jones Austin, the Honorable Congressman Gregory Meeks, the Honorable Leticia James, Attorney General of the state of New York. The goal of today's gathering was hearing and healing. And by hearing, I pray we have begun that journey that will lead us to that healing. The pillar statement of belief in my faith community is the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel. Israel meaning those who are in a struggle with God. We are all in that struggle right now. The call for us to hear and acknowledge our connection to our common Creator. One of the things that we have heard in the Jewish community, I know between JCRC and UJA, we recently began a Jewish coalition on criminal justice reform. We're about to launch another coalition that will hopefully be able to raise up and solve some of the issues of disparities, healthcare disparities that had caused the death of so many during this virus that we are afflicted by. The call to hear is quickly followed in the Shema by a call to act, a call to have our hearts, our souls, and our physical beings focus on the act of engaging the world with this knowledge of what we have heard, a call to become partners in bringing what we have heard into reality to all we encounter, no exceptions. As we walk through our lives and the lives of all we meet, most of all, with our children, as we guide them, but most of all, are guided by them. Our responsibility now upon hearing is to take in and become part of that healing with our hearts, with all our souls, and with all our physical beings. We need to become part of the answer. And by hearing and doing together, we can move our world forward. Thank you for all being with us today, and to our partners and teachers who have opened our hearts and have given us guidance. May we all be blessed by these words and the actions of a world moving towards, as Pastor Charles said, a complete shalom.